Welcome back, Geo students, for your second set of notes with agriculture. In this set, we're going to focus on subsistence farming. So we'll look at the characteristics of subsistence agriculture, and then we'll also shift gears and finish with some current agricultural issues. Let's start by looking at shifting cultivation. Shifting cultivation is also known as slash and burn farming. It's the practice of taking an area that is a lot of vegetation and clearing it off, either cutting it down and burning the debris for the nutrients, goes into the soil, and then you farm that land for a period of 3 to 4 years. And then the land, after that 3 to 4 years, the soil has been sapped of its nutrients. So it is left alone for a period of 6 to 20 years where the vegetation regrows and then eventually can get cut down and burned again, and that same process is repeated. So the problem with that is it requires a large area. It also, this type of cultivation, the amount of it is shrinking due to other industries creeping in. It's a major factor in deforestation in Latin America, and it also provides low yields to crops. I meant to put this slide earlier. Apparently it went in the wrong spot. But what I wanted to show you, this is the important one that we're going to be using for the activity that you need after you do the note check. So the types of subsistence agriculture that we're covering today, these are your options, are going to be shifting cultivation, intensive subsistence, wet rice dominant, intensive subsistence, wet rice not the dominant crop, something called pastoral nomadism, and we're also going to include plantation farming in there because it occurs in less developed countries. It is producing crops for profit. However, most of the people that are actually doing the farming are only getting paid very low wages and provided with some of the essentials that they need to survive. So it functions much more like a subsistence agriculture, with the exception of the large businesses or owners of the plantation. So back to shifting cultivation. Here's an image of some clear cutting going on so you can see how thick the vegetation is and then how much of it is cleared away and then farmed. In the Amazon, this was a big issue 20 years ago, still continues to be today. You can see that subsistence agriculture comprised about 33% of the deforestation that occurs. Cattle ranching, clearing and letting the animals graze is about 60. So there's 93% of the deforestation causes alone. And then there are some of the other causes there. Pastoral nomadism is the next type of subsistence agriculture we want to discuss. It's going to be commonly found in drier areas where crops are going to be difficult to grow, and so it is reliant upon the herding of animals and following the animals from their grazing location to grazing location. So you're looking at animals like camels, goats, and sheep, most commonly, are those that are herded in pastoral nomadism. So those animals provide milk, and they provide fur and skins, and probably to some extent meat as well. So the nomads that farm and raise this livestock, they get food for trading for the animal products, or they might have some small subsistence farms in wetter areas, and we'll get to that in the next set of slides, next type of farming. So the migration of the pastoral nomads often follows a pattern, because it's following the pattern that the animals follow year to year. And this style of farming is continuing to shrink due to technology and land competition. Increasing population in the world is crowding out pastoral nomadism as an option. One example that you may have seen before is in a nomadic lifestyle is the construction of a yurt. Over at Afton State Park, there are yurts that are available for rent that were constructed, I'd say about 5 years ago or so. So if you want to see a yurt up close, the state park nearby has one of those. This next slide covers two types of agriculture. It covers intensive subsistence, wet rice dominant, and wet rice not dominant. Basically what you're looking at here is that in densely populated areas in less developed countries, there's not a lot of land available for large farms. So instead, The fields are very small and little land is wasted, and people are using that to produce food for themselves, and any extra that's left over they'll sell to try to be able to get other necessities to survive. So you'll find animals and basic tools being used, beasts of burden we call those, and you can see that the oxen used down in the lower right corner. In Southeast Asia and East India, the dominant crop is wet rice, so we separate that from other forms of intensive subsistence agriculture. Or you might see things like in northern China or the interior of India where there's wheat, barley, and other grains being grown, or cash crops like cotton or tobacco. The thing about intensive subsistence is that it's extremely labor intensive, and so it requires a lot of people to be able to do it. When you look at rice production worldwide, you can see the parts of the world that we're talking about, that wet rice dominant intensive subsistence farming is occurring here primarily. And here you have an image of harvesting wet rice grown in the paddies or the sawas, like we said in the previous slide. Now, the last type of subsistence farming we're going to address is plantation farming. It is treated somewhat as its own, kind of a hybrid between what you find with commercial and subsistence, because like I said earlier, large commercial farms, they're owned by either businesses or very wealthy landowners, but plantations today are commonly found in tropical locations in less developed countries. Often they're owned by foreign companies. The crops that you might find produced there are cotton, sugar, coffee, rubber, and tobacco. The workers then are imported or maybe living in the country that the plantation's located. And yes, plantation farming was a common practice in the southern United States prior to the Civil War. And when you see crops like cotton and sugar and tobacco, those are some major crops that were farmed on plantations in the southern U.S., especially prior to the Civil War and after. So you see this style of home pretty common on a plantation in the South. Large pillars, two to 3 stories high. So that is going to be a feature that's pretty characteristic. That's where the landowners live. Then the workers have their separate quarters. In the United States, they would be slave quarters. Even the modern subsistence farmer who works on a plantation farm isn't far off from slavery if they aren't considered slaves. So let's shift over to modern agricultural issues. One issue is dealing with overproduction. What happens when farmers grow too many crops? And then countries have to deal with what we call as a surplus. And we don't want farmers to create too much of a surplus, because that means we're wasting resources when that happens. So in some years, farmers will be asked to plant rest crops, like they'll grow clover or hay, which livestock, of course, can use. And the government ends up subsidizing or giving payments to farmers when they have to rest their fields. And the government will buy off surplus crops that are grown, like if there is overproduction, and they'll try to sell them in the international market, or if they can't do that, they'll donate them to less developed countries. And that's a practice of good faith, because when you are donating to less developed countries, you're investing in them, and you're also hoping that you might be able to gain a favor back from those countries in the future. When you look at farms in the U.S. receiving government payments or those subsidies, where sometimes those fields are laid to rest, you can see it's in the areas where we were growing grain, and we had mixed crop and livestock, so soybeans, corn, and grains primarily. And again, in that same stretch here, the payment from other programs. When you look at countries that are producing surpluses of crops, you see in North America, newly industrialized countries in Latin America, a few countries in Africa, Western Africa in particular, and Eastern Africa. And then over in Southeast Asia and Oceania and Europe. Another modern agricultural issue would be sustainable farming. And so there's been a movement pushed towards organic farming over the last 25, 30 years or so. Only about 0.25% of the world's farmland is used for organic farming. The idea here is to limit the use of herbicides and pesticides, which have been shown to have negative health effects on animals and humans. Instead, the idea is to integrate crops and livestock. And this is actually the type of farming that is going to go back and kind of is captured by that Chipotle video that we watched to start the week off. It's a true mixed crop and livestock form of farming where you balance the number of animals with the crops that are grown, and you're limiting the animal confinement as best you can, trying to get away from that idea of a concentrated animal feeding operation or a CAFO. So here you can see an image of it and comparing what you see from a commercial farming operation to an organic farming operation, trying to limit the runoff into the water and affecting the animals there, trying to also limit pesticides. What else do we see here? And weed growth. So you're using some of the animals to help mitigate that rather than using chemicals. The organic food industry has grown, and this is over 10 years old now, but you can still see some food products that I'm sure are familiar. You have the large company like a Kellogg, but some of the organic foods, maybe like the Bare Naked cereals that you've seen, or Kashi cereal. A company like General Mills right here in the western part of the Twin Cities over in Golden Valley. You have like Euroglen is an offshoot of that. So you could take time to look at this entire diagram if you'd like to see if there are other organic foods that you're familiar with. And why do that? Well, when we talk about herbicides, these are chemical products designed to kill weeds. And where are they most widely used? Well, they're most widely used in that part of the U.S. where we have mixed crop and livestock, where we have grains, oats, and barley being grown. And the same goes with the fertilizers, okay? And the deal is that the fertilizers and the herbicides can wind up in the water supply as well, so it can affect the animals not only locally, but it can have effects that continue on. If fertilizers are going into the waters of the Mississippi, well, some of that stuff can travel all the way down, right? And you've got the Ohio River, and you can see there's potential pollution coming in there, and you've got the Missouri River, which also cuts through the heart of where herbicides and pesticides are being used. So there are some environmental considerations that need to be made when we're using herbicides and pesticides to produce our food. Now, as far as organic production, say it's not used more than 0.25% worldwide, but used a little more widely in the United States. You can see various places in the country where organic farms have at least 250 acres. The products that the experts suggest that you buy organic, you probably see organic food sections in your grocery store. They say peaches, apples, bell peppers, celery, nectarines, strawberries, cherries, kale, lettuce, grapes, carrots, and pears. These are all foods that are pretty susceptible to insects and attacks, so they often have larger use of pesticides on them. So if you can get them organic, that means the pesticide use has been limited. Over here on this side, you have the Cleanest 15. These are tougher and maybe less desirable plants that bugs, pests don't attack. So those ones you could probably feel good about buying regularly in the grocery store and limiting the amount of pesticides that have been used to create your food. Continuing with subsistence farmers, there's a lot of pressure to produce more for the growing populations. And promoting development through exports is one way to help grow that population and support the growing population by selling products and being able to buy other necessities in return. There are strategies in place for increasing the supply of food in less developed countries, like expanding land area used for farming, but that can lead to deforestation and desertification if you're pulling up trees and plants that have deep roots that are on the fringe of really arid areas, you can end up increasing the size of the arid areas, which end up potentially leading to deserts in the future. One thing that we can find is that we are increasing productivity in less developed countries through Norman Borlaug's Green Revolution. I alluded to that in our last set of notes when we talked about the exchange of crops from one part of the world to the other. So as more productive strains of corn and rice and wheat were being developed in labs and universities at the University of Minnesota and University of Iowa, where Borlaug worked, he brought some of his findings from these labs all the way to India and other countries, Mexico, other countries in the world, where they could plant those crops and grow them and increased how productive each acre of land could be. Finding new sources of food is another strategy to try to help increase the food supply in less developed countries. So going to the ocean, looking for things that are edible underwater and harvesting those. Looking for grains that are higher in protein and improve the palatability for people. And then lastly, encouraging positive relations, international relations, so that exports and imports can be a possibility for countries. So through cooperation. When you look at the percent of undernourished people worldwide, there is some good news for the most part. A lot of parts of the world from 1970 forward in the last 50 years have dramatically decreased the percent of people in their country that are part of the world or region of the world that are undernourished. There is an area that still needs to be focused upon. And again, I think in the next 50 years, you're going to see many of these countries in sub-Saharan Africa start to reach that stage of being newly industrialized, and we will start seeing this decline. When you look at a chart that illustrates Borlaug's Green Revolution, think back to when we talked about Malthus. Remember, Malthus said that the human population was going to reproduce faster than the supplies could be grown. Well, with some of the work done by Borlaug and other scientists at universities, they've been able to increase the yield of crops. So when you look at, say, grain production worldwide, you can see that this part here is representing the amount of land that was used to grow the grain. Before it was introduced in 1960, it was relatively low. But as they grew the new strains of crops, you can see there's and just new farming methods as well, combining those two things, there's much more productivity and yield on the same amount of space that there was 50 years earlier, 40 years earlier, according to this graphic. That's a pretty big gap. So there is some hope. And so this would be a type of graphic that an anti-Malthus person would use to say, hey, look, technology will help increase the supplies and can help offset some of the population growth that we have. So in summary, and I like this chart to end, well, it's almost end for you guys. Yeah, it will be the end. Just shows the difference between subsistence and commercial farming. So where are they largely practiced? Well, subsistence farming you're going to find in less developed countries, commercial farming in more developed countries. The reason why people are doing the subsistence farming is for survival, whereas in commercial farming, you're doing it to sell the crops and make a profit. The number of percent of people that are in the labor force that are farmers in subsistence farming heavy countries are going to have a high percentage of people that are farmers. In commercial farming regions and countries, you're going to have a low percentage of people that are farmers because a lot of machinery can do the work. The use of machinery versus animals, you find animals being used for farming and subsistence farming, like actually doing the work. You find machinery doing the work in commercial farms. The size of the farms in subsistence farming, with a few exceptions, when you think of the slash and burn or shifting cultivation, those could be larger, but a lot of the farms are small in subsistence farming, whereas they can be very large, hundreds of acres in commercial farms. And then lastly, the relationship of farming to other businesses in the region. Well, sometimes they're going to have to barter or use some of what they get from their agriculture to meet their needs in subsistence farming. Whereas in commercial, you're not necessarily trading your animal or farm products for something else you need. You're getting money in return for it, and then you turn around and spend those dollars on whatever you need. There is a note check after this set of notes for you, and back towards the beginning, is it the third slide? I'm gonna actually scroll back up, bear with me here. Scroll back up, because I'm just gonna show you the slide that you are gonna need for your Ag Stories activity, this Global Agriculture Importance slide. Make sure you have this handy when you're doing the Ag Stories, because it is going to be critical. All right. Good luck. Thanks for listening.